Before China had an emperor, it had borders everywhere, fortified passes, guarded river crossings, roads that stopped at another king's territory, fields that could belong to one state this year and another the next. 7 great powers faced one another across this fractured landscape, each racing to become stronger before its rivals did. Their rulers called themselves kings. Their armies grew larger. Officials counted grain, households, weapons, land and taxes with new precision. Philosophers argued over the ideal state, while commanders searched for the fastest way to defeat a real one. By the 3rd century BCE, war was no longer an interruption to political life. War had become the system. And on the western edge of that system, one kingdom was learning how to turn rivalry into machinery. That kingdom was Qin. Within a few decades, this once peripheral power would eliminate every rival kingdom, abolish the political order that had defined the age, and replace a world of competing kings with a single imperial state across the former warring states realm. Qin was not the oldest or most culturally prestigious of the great states, and for much of its history, it was not the obvious candidate to dominate the rest. To many Eastern courts, it seemed distant, severe, almost peripheral to the older centers of Zhou civilization. But distance gave Qin something its rivals did not always possess: room to change. Its rulers became unusually willing to reorganize society around a hard political truth. The state that could mobilize more land, more food, more labor, and more soldiers than its neighbors would eventually decide the fate of them all. The empire that emerged in 221 BCE was not created in one brilliant campaign or by one extraordinary man. It was forged over generations by reformers and generals, farmers and clerks, engineers and migrants, long before the first emperor claimed that title. To understand why Qin won, we have to step back into a world where there was no emperor at all. Centuries earlier, the Zhou kings had claimed authority over a broad network of regional lords. But after the royal court moved east in 770 BCE, Zhou power weakened. Local rulers became increasingly independent. Smaller states disappeared. Larger states absorbed their neighbors. The map became simpler and more dangerous. By the Warring States period, 7 major powers dominated the struggle: Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei. This was not China in the modern national sense, projected backward into antiquity. It was a connected cultural and political world with shared traditions and intense exchange, but divided among rival courts with their own laws, armies, ambitions, and memories. And those rivalries changed almost everything. The great paradox of the Warring States era is that destruction accelerated invention. The older world of aristocratic chariot warfare gave way increasingly to mass infantry, cavalry, crossbows, fortifications, and organized supply systems. Larger armies created larger administrative problems. A soldier needed grain. Grain needed transport. Transport needed roads. Roads needed labor. Labor had to be registered, taxes assessed, and every district measured for what it could provide. What looks from a distance like military history was also a revolution in paperwork. War pushed governments toward better administration. Better administration made even larger wars possible. Every major state was adapting. Qin's advantage was the exceptional consistency with which it connected agriculture, taxation, military service, law, and territorial control. A decisive transformation began in the 4th century BCE, when the reformer Shang Yang entered the service of Duke Xiao of Qin. The policies associated with Shang Yang attacked hereditary privilege and tied advancement more closely to state service. Households were registered more systematically, agriculture encouraged, local administration tightened. A military achievement could bring rank and reward. Collective responsibility helped enforce order. These policies are often associated with what later scholars called legalism, though the label can make a diverse intellectual tradition seem too uniform. Qin's practical lesson was simpler. A ruler should not depend on powerful families. The state needed enforceable rules, measurable incentives, and institutions capable of functioning beyond personal loyalty. For an ordinary household, that transformation was not an abstract theory. Registration made families increasingly visible to the government as units that could be counted, taxed, rewarded, punished, and mobilized. Farming, military obligation, and administration were being drawn into the same expanding system. Shang Yang himself discovered how impersonal such a system could become. After Duke Xiao died, Shang Yang lost political protection. His enemies moved against him, and he was executed.
The reformer vanished. The reforms did not.
That may be one of the most revealing moments in the rise of Qin. A political system had begun to appear whose strength did not rest entirely on one ruler or noble clan. Registers, offices, military obligations, rewards, punishments, and territorial administration gave the government more direct access to people and resources. A man could die. The machinery could continue. By the late 4th century BCE and into the 3rd, Qin was no longer merely a Western state struggling to keep pace. It had become one of the most formidable powers in East Asia. Its strength was visible in more than armies. After a battle, the decisive question was who counted the households, collected the grain, appointed officials, controlled roads, and recruited the next soldiers. Qin could mobilize labor, move supplies, reorganize conquered districts, and absorb territory into its own administrative structure. That changed the meaning of conquest. Defeating an enemy army could be temporary. Destroying a rival state's capacity to tax, govern, recruit, and command was something deeper. The result was more durable than battlefield submission. Once Qin absorbed a conquered territory into its own administrative structure, the defeated political order became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. And then, in 247 BCE, a young king came to the throne. His name was Ying Zheng. He would eventually be remembered as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. But at that moment, there was nothing inevitable about the title. Qin was powerful, but 6 other great states still survived. Coalitions could form, generals could fail, and court factions could disrupt policy. The stronger Qin became, the more obvious the danger appeared to everyone else. Every victory brought Qin closer to supremacy and gave its enemies another reason to stop it. The final conquest was not one legendary battle. It was a sequence of collapses. Qin combined military pressure with diplomacy, intelligence, intimidation, political maneuvering, and, most importantly, the administrative ability to keep armies supplied far from home. Han fell in 230 BCE. Zhao's main kingdom was conquered in 228, though resistance continued elsewhere. Wei fell in 225. By then, the sequence looked relentless. But Chu was enormous, wealthy and powerful in the south, a rival large enough to make Qin's advance feel far from inevitable. It resisted longer, but Qin defeated it in 223. Yan fell in 222.
Then in 221 BCE, Qi surrendered. The rhythm had become almost terrifying. One court after another vanished from the political map. In less than a decade, the balance that had defined the warring states was gone. In roughly a decade, Ying Zheng had done what generations of kings had failed to do. Then came the harder question. Had Qin conquered a collection of kingdoms, or something that could become one state? Previous rulers could imagine supremacy as a hierarchy, one dominant royal house above lesser kings. Ying Zheng rejected that model. If defeated royal families remained in power, their courts could become centers of rebellion. If the old kingdom survived beneath a thin layer of Qin authority, the old map could return the moment Qin weakened. So Ying Zheng did something radical. He did not declare himself the greatest king. He declared kingship itself too small for the new order. He adopted a new imperial title, Huangdi. He would be the first emperor. The change was more than ceremonial language. It announced that the old order had not merely changed hands, it was supposed to have ended. The Qin court imagined emperors stretching indefinitely into the future, inheriting a realm no longer divided among hereditary sovereigns. The dynasty expected permanence. History would give it barely 15 years after unification. But before it collapsed, Qin transformed the political map beneath the emperor's feet.
At court, officials debated whether conquered territories should be granted to imperial relatives as hereditary kingdoms. The centralized model prevailed. Qin extended a system of commanderies and counties governed by appointed officials. Local authority now connected upward to the imperial government, rather than permanently to hereditary aristocracy. A governor served because the state appointed him, not simply because his ancestors had ruled the land. The aim was unmistakable: never allow the warring states to assemble themselves again. That ambition meant unification had to leave the palace and enter the market, the road, the tax register, and the clerk's desk. Before 221 BCE, crossing a state border could mean encountering different currencies, weights, measures, administrative conventions, and written forms. For merchants, it meant friction. For tax collectors, confusion. For armies, delay. To a ruler of conquered territory, every difference was another place where control could weaken. Qin attacked those differences. The government standardized weights and measures, imposed a common coinage, and promoted a standardized official script. Traditional sources also credit the regime with regulating vehicle gauges or axle widths, helping transport move more consistently along imperial roads. These changes sound dry in a textbook, but they touched daily administration. Standard weights made grain easier to assess. Common coinage simplified transactions, and a shared administrative script made orders and records easier to compare. This was one of Qin's less spectacular revolutions, and one of its most important: compatibility. An empire is not held together only by soldiers. It is also held together by things that agree with one another. The writing reform reveals this logic especially clearly. The people of the former states did not suddenly begin speaking one language. Regional speech remained diverse. Cultural differences did not disappear because an emperor issued a command. What the government could standardize was official written practice. An order could leave Shang Yang, be copied by a clerk, carried hundreds of kilometers, entered into a local record, and answered through the same administrative system. That was power, in a form no battlefield monument could fully display. A political frontier had disappeared. In its place came documents, and the documents traveled on roads. The first emperor expanded and integrated a network of imperial routes connecting the capital, Shang Yang, with distant regions. Roads carried troops, messengers, officials, grain, reports, and commands. Their deeper meaning was political. A road told a conquered landscape where the center was. Every route toward the imperial core transformed geography into administration. The emperor did not need to stand in every district if officials, orders, supplies, and reports could move between that district and the center. The empire was becoming a network. But the farther that network reached, the more clearly its limits appeared. Qin's famous northern walls reveal just how incomplete imperial control remained. The first emperor did not build the stone Great Wall, seen by most visitors today. Much of the best-known surviving wall belongs to the Ming Dynasty, constructed more than a millennium and a half later. Long before unification, northern states had already built defensive barriers.
After 221 BCE, Qin forces connected, repaired, extended, or replaced sections of earlier frontier works to secure the northern approaches. So the Great Wall was not one wall, built once by one emperor. It was a changing frontier system, constructed and reconstructed across centuries. The correction matters because political unification itself was also a process, not a finished modern map suddenly appearing in antiquity. The Qin Empire was vast, but it should not be imagined as the modern borders of China appearing in 221 BCE. Imperial power remained uneven, especially on the frontiers, and expansion north and south did not instantly create cultural uniformity. A decree could abolish a border faster than memory could erase it. Qin Shi Huang had little patience for slow integration. Unity had to be visible. Later historical accounts describe confiscated weapons, dismantled internal fortifications, and powerful families relocated from conquered regions closer to the imperial center. The court launched immense projects: roads, Palaces, canals, frontier defenses, and a mausoleum unlike anything its age had seen. For former rival kingdoms, the message was unmistakable. Walls could be dismantled, elites moved, and resources redirected towards Xianyang. That capacity was astonishing. So was its cost. Qin demanded taxes, military service, and labor on a massive scale. Later Han historians remembered the dynasty as oppressively harsh, and their accounts must be read carefully. The Han had every reason to explain why Qin deserved to fall. But hostile memory cannot erase physical scale. Roads existed. Walls were repaired and extended. Palaces rose. Armies moved. The emperor's funerary complex consumed enormous resources. Whatever later writers exaggerated, Qin clearly possessed an extraordinary ability to mobilize people and material. A government made powerful by counting households had also become extremely efficient at making demands on them. Nowhere is that ambition more visible than east of modern Xi'an. In 1974, farmers digging a well encountered terracotta fragments that led archaeologists toward one of the most extraordinary funerary discoveries ever made. Thousands of life-size terracotta warriors stood in ordered formations near the first emperor's mausoleum, joined by horses, chariots, weapons, officials, entertainers, and other figures from a much larger funerary landscape. The first impression is scale. The second is individuality.
Faces, hairstyles, armor, posture, and rank vary. Yet archaeology also reveals organized workshop production. Repeated components assembled in different combinations, then finished with individual details. Mass production and variation existed together, a striking metaphor for Qin. The empire did not require every person to be identical. It required difference to become administratively manageable, and the Terracotta Army was only one part of the burial complex. The mausoleum includes numerous pits and associated sites across a huge area. At its center stands Qin Shi Huang's burial mound. The main chamber has never been fully excavated. That absence creates one of the most powerful gaps in ancient history. We know the army outside, but not the full reality of the world built around the emperor inside. Our most famous description comes from Sima, writing about a century later. He described a subterranean palace with treasures and mechanisms, a model of the heavens above, and rivers of mercury representing the empire below. It is a haunting image. But this is where evidence and tradition must be separated. The mausoleum scale is archaeologically undeniable. The terracotta warriors are real, and the central chamber remains unopened. Sima Qian's description is invaluable testimony, not an eyewitness view inside the tomb. That distinction becomes even more important when we reach the most notorious part of the first emperor's reputation. In 213 BCE, according to the historical tradition preserved by Sima Qian, the chief minister Li Si made a case at court. Scholars, he argued, were using old texts and earlier political models to criticize the present government. The regime responded with an order targeting categories of privately held historical and philosophical writings. Practical texts, including works related to agriculture, medicine, and divination, were exempted, while official collections were treated differently. The episode is commonly remembered as the burning of the books. The phrase is dramatic, but its political logic is even more revealing. Qin had standardized weights because competing measures complicated control. It had standardized official writing because competing administrative forms complicated control. From the court's perspective, competing versions of political memory could also be dangerous. A scholar praising an older order might not simply be discussing history. He could be suggesting that the present order should be replaced. The next episode is more uncertain. Traditional accounts tell of hundreds of men being put to death the following year, later remembered in the famous story of Confucian scholars being buried alive. Modern historians have questioned important parts of that interpretation. The victims may not have formed a single class of Confucian scholars. Some may have been court specialists, practitioners, or seekers of immortality accused of deception. The surviving accounts do not allow every detail to be reconstructed confidently. Something serious appears to stand behind the tradition, but the later legend is more precise than the evidence allows. That difference matters because Qin Shi Huang's reputation was shaped not only by what happened, but by who wrote about it afterward. And his struggle for control was not limited to texts or officials. He traveled repeatedly through the empire. Imperial tours let Qin Shi Huang inspect territory, perform rituals, erect inscriptions, and make the new order visible, far from Shang Yang. For people who had once lived under another king, the emperor's arrival carried its own message. The conqueror was no longer beyond the frontier. The frontier was gone. But the tours also exposed a deeper weakness. The 6 conquered states had lost their kings, but not their memories. Stories of assassination attempts surrounded Ying Zheng even before unification. The most famous is the mission of Jing Ke, sent by the state of Yan in 227 BCE. Its detailed drama survives in later literature and cannot be independently verified in every detail. But the political danger it represents was real. For Qin's enemies, one ruler's death could still seem like a path back to the world he had destroyed. The first emperor survived human enemies. He could not defeat time. As he aged, later sources describe an intense search for longevity and immortality. Court specialists offered methods and promises, and expeditions were reportedly sent in search of eternal life. For a ruler who had conquered 6 kingdoms, death was the one frontier that refused to submit. He could abolish kingdoms, standardize measures, send roads across vast distances, and command thousands of terracotta soldiers to guard his tomb. But the state powerful enough to reorganize millions of lives could not guarantee one more year of his own. In 210 BCE, during an imperial journey, Qin Shi Huang died. Suddenly, the entire structure faced a question it had never truly answered. What happens to overwhelming central authority when the man at the center disappears? What followed is known largely from Sima Qian's account. According to that tradition, the emperor's death was initially concealed, while Zhao Gao and the chief minister Li Si helped manipulate the succession in favor of the younger son, Hu Hai. The details are difficult to verify independently. The result is not. Hu Hai became the second emperor, and a system designed to eliminate political uncertainty discovered the danger of concentrating so much power at the center. When the center failed, the shock traveled outward. Factional struggle intensified. The burdens of Qin rule remained heavy. Confidence weakened. Then, in 209 BCE, rebellion erupted. The uprising of Chen Sheng and Wu Guang became one of the great symbols of Qin's collapse. Traditional accounts remember them as conscripts who turned desperation into revolt. Their movement did not last. It did not need to. The barrier had broken. Across the former warring states, resistance spread. Local grievances merged with older political identities. Men rallied in the names of kingdoms Qin had supposedly erased. The old map had been abolished in administration, but it still survived in memory. Powerful rebel leaders emerged, including Shang Yu of Chu and Liu Bang, the man who would eventually found the Han Dynasty. The collapse was astonishingly fast. Qin armies had destroyed the greatest states of their age. They could not save the dynasty from disintegration within. By 206 BCE, only about 15 years after the unification of 221, Qin rule was over. The first emperor had imagined a line of successors stretching indefinitely into the future. His dynasty barely outlived him. By almost any ordinary measure, that should have made Qin a failure. Instead, the dynasty failed, while the political framework it had made possible survived. The rebels destroyed Qin rule, but they did not simply restore the world that had existed before 221 BCE. After years of further conflict, Liu Bang founded the Han Dynasty. The Han rejected parts of Qin's reputation and modified many methods, while later drawing heavily on traditions associated with Confucian statecraft. But they inherited a political landscape Qin had transformed. The imperial title survived. So did the machinery of centralized government. Commanderies and counties continued to matter, and many of the standardized systems imposed under Qin outlived the dynasty that had enforced them. Above all, one idea proved impossible to erase. The realm could be governed as a single empire, rather than permanently divided among equal kings. The dynasty died. The architecture of empire survived. That is why Qin Shi Huang resists every simple label. Call him a tyrant, and you miss the scale of what his state created. Call him a visionary, and you risk ignoring what that creation demanded from ordinary people. He destroyed political orders that had existed for generations, yet institutions built under his rule endured. He unified a realm, but unification meant conquering mature states with their own histories, elites, traditions, and loyalties. The first emperor did not unite an empty map. He broke an existing political world and built another one over it. And even that achievement was not his alone. The deeper story begins long before Ying Zheng. Jew traditions shaped ideas of legitimate rule. Rival states experimented with administration, taxation, agriculture, military organization, and law. Thinkers argued over virtue, ritual, order, power, nature, and human behavior. Warfare forced governments to become more capable. Qin did not invent every instrument it used. It combined them, intensified them, standardized them, and applied them with extraordinary consistency. Ying Zheng stood at the end of that long transformation. In 221 BCE, he pushed it across a threshold no previous ruler had crossed. And then came the strangest part. His dynasty failed, but the expectation of unity did not. China would fragment many times afterward. Dynasties would fall, capitals move, borders expand and contract, and institutions, religions, technologies, and identities change. Yet after Qin, political division existed beside the memory of unification. That memory changed the terms of the future. It was no longer possible to claim that a vast realm could never be governed under one emperor. Qin had demonstrated that it could. The harder problem was how to make such unity last, without reproducing the failures that destroyed Qin itself. Near Qian, thousands of terracotta warriors still stand in formation beneath the earth. They were created for a ruler who demanded permanence. He did not receive it in the form he expected. His family lost the empire. His dynasty vanished. Many of his palaces disappeared.
Yet the political logic created in his age was inherited by the very people who overthrew him. That may be Qin Shi Huang's greatest historical irony. He failed to create an eternal dynasty, but he left behind a political problem that would outlive almost everything else around him. How should a vast and diverse realm be held together? By force? By law? By ritual? By bureaucracy? By shared culture? By all of them at once? Later rulers would answer differently for more than 2,000 years. Some would reject Qin's harshness. Some would preserve or adapt its institutions. Some would elevate moral traditions the Qin state had tried to subordinate. Others would rebuild unity after long periods of division. But none could return to a world in which the first empire had never existed. That is the deeper legacy of 221 BCE. Not an eternal dynasty, not an unbroken political system, and not a simple beginning of modern China. It was a precedent, proof that rival states could be conquered, reorganized, standardized, and governed through a single imperial center. A precedent so powerful that even Qin's enemies inherited it. And so the story returns to the place where the first emperor hoped his own story would never truly end. Beneath the earth, beside an unopened tomb, an army of clay still waits in formation. The ruler they were made to guard could not conquer death. The dynasty they symbolized could not conquer rebellion. Yet the imperial future Qin helped make possible proved far harder to bury. A ruler who wanted eternity lost his dynasty in a generation. But the problem his empire posed to history, how to turn conquest into lasting unity, endured far beyond him.